So, welcome back to the third in this reflection as regards prayer and the inspiration that we draw from Carmelite spirituality. Brother Matt is the one speaking with us in this short series, and today in this session we will be looking towards Saint Teresa of Avila to see what insights she has for us as we pursue this path of prayer. Father Matt, welcome once again. I will begin by drawing attention to the episodes in the Gospels where the disciples see Jesus praying, and seeing him praying, they approach him and put that important request to him: Lord, teach us how to pray. I suppose in a certain way this was similar with Saint Teresa, whose sisters had approached her and asked her to put something down, some kind of teaching about prayer. And the result of that was her first attempt to write something that could serve as a guide for those who wanted to learn how to pray. In light of this, what can we say, or can you offer us a cursory view of Saint Teresa's approach and understanding of prayer?
Okay, so you began your question with the disciples coming to Jesus in the gospel and asking him, teach us to pray. And of course, that's the thing he doesn't do. He doesn't teach them to pray. Rather, he says to them, when you pray, use these words. Or if you wish to use these words, say these words. These are words that might be helpful to you when you are praying. Because, of course, the disciples are already praying. The very fact that they're there with Jesus means they're praying. The very fact, the very words teach us to pray is itself a prayer. They are already praying. And so he gives them words that they may need to use or might find helpful. That's what we now call the Lord's Prayer. Teresa's experience would be something very similar. Teresa, from the very beginning, wants to pray, desires to pray. But she struggles greatly to pray. One of the great things we have about Teresa in her writings is that we can build a very good picture of her own life, her own experience. We're both given her teaching on prayer and we're given her own personal experience. So we can get a very good understanding of her experience. And her experience perhaps can go something like this. Teresa would have been taught to pray when she would have entered the convent. That's how things were done in those days. And by being taught to pray, what that means is that she'd have been taught certain methods of prayer. And none of them worked for her. In fact, we could say that Teresa couldn't pray. This great teacher of prayer really struggled to pray. She even tells us that she gave up prayer several times. What she meant, of course, is that she gave up trying to use the methods of prayer that she was taught, that she was expected to use, which she couldn't use. So Teresa was unable to pray in the way that she was expected to pray, or in the way that was the norm of her time. And yet, Teresa still tried to pray, and struggled to pray, and wanted to pray, and of course, was praying, was never not praying, was praying all the time. And it took her a long time to recognize that. And so, as you've asked me, when her sisters came to her to teach them how to pray, again, that's very surprising, because she was already teaching them to pray, and had been for a few years, and for some of them much longer than that. Because Teresa was teaching others to pray from quite an early age herself. And even during the times when she herself said she had given up prayer or was struggling to pray, she was at the same time teaching others to pray. And so these women who have been taught by Teresa and are with her every day still feel the need for more, still want more from her. They know she has written the book of her life for her confessors who asked her to write about prayer. And now when they ask her what gives rise to what we now call the way of perfection, and 2 versions of that book have come down to us. It's interesting what she does in that book in response to what the sisters ask her. She doesn't do what we would expect, and that is to give us some kind of a guidance as to how to pray. This is how you do it. Or give us some method of prayer. She doesn't do that. Rather, what she does, first of all, is gives the purpose of prayer. And the purpose has to be big. The world is in turmoil. Therefore, we are going to live our lives well. In other words, what we're setting out to do is something that the world very much needs. What we're setting out to do is the very thing that can change our world. It's the very thing that's the answer to all the world's needs. So that's an enormous lesson in prayer for all of us. We must think big, because prayer is big. Prayer is not something small or unimportant. Prayer is big, it's important. It is the biggest, most important thing anybody could set out to do. And it is the most powerful force in our world. Teresa's conviction is that prayer can change the world. Teresa's conviction is that the world needs prayer more than it needs anything else. So that's her starting point. We've got to know why we're doing this. We've got to think big. And the second thing that she starts off with is, she poses the question, what kind of people are we? And she makes a distinction. And it's a very important distinction for Teresa. And it is the distinction between prayer and a life of prayer. Teresa's interest, we might say, is not so much in prayer as in the life of prayer, or the life of the person of prayer. What kind of people are we? How are we living? What kind of relationships do we have? That for her was the essential. That's what she was really interested in. Because prayer involves the whole person and the whole life of the person. So that's the response that she gives to her sisters. Think big. Look at ourselves. Look at the kind of people that we are and the kind of life that we're living. So to come back to her own experience. And she tells us that she only writes what she knows from experience. And that, of course, was revolutionary in her day. Books about prayer were always written in a very academic way, scholarly works, etc. Here's this woman writing about herself, writing about her own experience. And her own experience, as I mentioned, was difficult. She struggled to pray. She was not good at it. That this great teacher of prayer found prayer very difficult. But of course that is, we can say now, part of God's providence, God's great plan. This woman is a great teacher of prayer because she knows how difficult prayer is. It's like God plunged her into all the difficulties of prayer, all the difficult places a person of prayer might find themselves in, so that she can speak from experience, so that she will be able to say something that is worthwhile for all of us. That's what gives her work such power, such effectiveness. So she struggles to pray. She experienced the difficulties of prayer. And she's able to write about prayer in the language of everyday life. Which I think brings me to the other key insight that Teresa gives us about prayer. And we could start with a phrase that is so often quoted from Teresa about God being among the pots and pans. That's where God is. But what does she mean by that? The pots and pans of everyday life, the everyday, the mundane, the routine, the not very exciting parts of our lives, or the parts perhaps that we might think are an obstacle to prayer. If I didn't have all this work to do, look at all the time I could spend praying. And Teresa's experience is the opposite to that. Teresa's life, her journey in life, goes something like this. The more her prayer grows and deepens, the busier she becomes. The more her prayer grows and deepens, the more involved she's becoming in the things of the world, the things of everyday life. Prayer doesn't take her away from the world, but rather takes her ever more deeply into it. Therefore, it is wherever the pots and pans of our lives are, that's where God is. That's where God will be found, God will be experienced. Teresa began her journey, in a sense, seeing prayer as one part of her life and another life to be lived, the everyday life. But the two come together. But Teresa, all is prayer. All is at the service of God. Just to illustrate what I'm saying, when she begins writing the book of her foundations, a book about her travels, her various works, setting up these communities, so many different practical things, she says at the beginning that this must be written with great care. Every detail must be accurate, must be properly recounted. And why? Not because she wants to leave a record of what she did herself, but no, it's because this is God's work. And if it's a work of God, then it is precious. And must be spoken about with the same reverence and care as the work that God does within the soul. Whether it's the work God does within the deepest place within the person, or the work that God does out there in the world and various activities and whatever she's involved in, it's the same work of God. It's the same God who is present and bringing this about. And therefore, it must be spoken about with the same respect and care. Prayer for Teresa, then, is the whole of life. Prayer and life become so intertwined. There is no distinction. All is prayer. All of life is at the service of God. All that she is doing, the many, many different things that she did, are all done to give honor and glory to God. You just have to pick up any of Teresa's letters, and luckily we have a great number of them have come down to us. And one just sees how she lives her life and how prayer is the purpose of everything, is the goal of everything. Everything she's doing, whatever it may be, is at the service of God and is partaking in the great work of God. So,
that's a very powerful insight. Prayer, understood as pertaining to every aspect of life. And in light of that understanding, the propelling force that moves us to desire to pray helps us recognize God present, even in the midst of things that demand our attention. I wonder if there are any further implications to this pursuit for those who eventually give up on the entire program of prayer. If this insight is proposed to them anew, what will we say is the new thing they can take away from this insight that can help them rekindle that desire to pray?
Several times in Teresa's writings, she tells us that the worst thing she ever did in her life was to give up prayer. And she all the time says to people, do not give up prayer. Whatever else may happen, never fall into the temptation of giving up prayer. That's the worst thing any human being can do. As long as one prays, whatever prayer is, whatever form it might take, whatever struggles there might be, however difficult it might be, as she famously says in the way of prayer, even if one dies along the way, just keep praying. Just let nothing stop one from praying. If one is praying, then one's life somehow remains on the right road. One will not go totally off track. If one is praying, then everything else somehow seems to fall into place. It's not about whether the prayer seems to us to be good or not, or seems to be successful or not, or have to achieve something or not. No, it's nothing got to do. It's not for us to assess the quality of our prayer or think we're making progress or we're not making progress, or what's the point of this? Is this only wasting time? Teresa keeps saying, keep praying. Just don't give up. Persevere. The two words that she uses all the time when she's speaking about prayer, courage and determination or perseverance. One needs courage because prayer involves facing oneself, entering into the unknown. And one needs that determination, that perseverance, that sense of never going to give up, whatever may happen, however it may go. Just keep going. So that's what she would say to anybody who is inclined to give up or has given. Just start again. Just keep starting again. She said, no. People of prayer, she said, have to keep starting over and over again. Don't make a big thing of it. Just start. Just start again. Don't pray today. If you don't pray tomorrow, if it goes on, just start. Just don't make a big thing of it. You can always start. Anytime. Just pick it up again. It will always have its effects. Those effects may not be visible, but they're there. It is always something worthwhile. That's what she all the time wants to press upon people. This is worthwhile. This is the most worthwhile thing you can be doing. But Teresa never gets drawn into, how it should be done, or what form it should take, or what outcome it might have, because that's in God's hands. That we've got to be free of. Just pray in whatever way you can, whatever way seems right for you or works for you. God does the rest. The rest will happen, whatever that may be. And if one keeps praying, somehow one's life doesn't go off track or too far off track. God will bring one back to the right road.
Indeed, it requires courage. And I suppose your reference, your recommendation that one should take on that courage is really an invitation for each person to actually just come before the Lord, regardless of our state, and simply present ourselves there, and prayer would have already begun. Just casting our minds to one understanding that Saint Teresa of prayer that Saint Teresa is regularly quoted for. Prayer as that intimate friendship between the soul and God. In Teresa's words, it's the intimate conversation with one with whom we know loves us. Is there anything from this understanding that we can draw on to help cultivate that courage that is needed? Would it mean courage to enter into friendship with God, even if we have no clue of what that means or what that entails? What would you say about that?
Well, Teresa has often been described as a woman of relationships. Reading her life, even knowing a little bit about her life story, looking at her writings, her letters, we see all the many different people that she was in relationship with. She was certainly a person of contacts, of friendship, of a very outgoing person. She knew so many different people. She also knew, and she tells us about it in her writings, as she experienced relationships that were not healthy. Relationships, in fact, that did great harm to her. So she is a student of human relationships, we could say. She has a keen interest in what is a good, life-giving, healthy relationship and what isn't. She has experienced both. She has really suffered and been held back by relationships that have not been healthy, that have not been life-giving. At the same time, her whole life, her whole growth as a person has been very dependent upon and helped by the many, many people with whom she had good and healthy relationships with. So this whole question of what's a good relationship, a healthy one, and what isn't, is one that preoccupies Teresa's life from quite an early age. Then when it comes to God, very much prayer is a relationship with God. It's not something that one does or a skill that one acquires. But it's an entering into a relationship, as you've already said, a friendship of love with one we know loves us. Therefore, there isn't a doubt here. In many human relationships, we've got to think, is this healthy or isn't it? Is this going the right way or isn't it? Is this person manipulating or using me or are they not? Questions come up. And we might think a relationship is very healthy and then realize at some stage, oh, this is not, there's manipulation, there's control here, there's other agendas play. With God, we can be sure that we're totally free of that. It's the one relationship we can enter into with absolute confidence, certainty. He loves me. Unconditionally, totally. There is nothing to fear from this relationship. There is no reason to be hesitant about this relationship. There's no reason to try and keep control here or put on a protective sort of mask around me or something. Here I can be totally open, totally myself before God. So it's a relationship of friendship. It's the relationship in which one learns and experiences total freedom and total acceptance. Another dimension of this that interests Teresa greatly, and that is the life of the person who is in this relationship with God. She is aware, long before modern psychology has pointed this out to us, is that we grow through relationships. And therefore she's always interested in the person of prayer. What kind of people are they? What kind of life is this person living? And so as the person grows in prayer, one becomes more human. One lives human life more freely and a more mature way. Therefore, right at the end of her interior castle in the 7th dwelling place, the 3rd chapter, she turns to this question. What kind of a person is this? What kind of a life is this person living? It is one of the originalities in all of Teresa's teaching on prayer. It's her interest in the person of prayer, the kind of person that a person living a very mature and profound prayer life is living. Because it is prayer that brings out for Teresa the fullness of humanity. The deeper we go into prayer, the more our prayer grows and matures, the more we mature and grow as human beings. The human being in the image and likeness of God. That is what we grow into. That is who we become when our prayer deepens and grows, matures. So it is that essential friendship with God. It is through that the human being becomes the person he or she is created to be, created to grow into, to become.
Thank you. It has really been very insightful hearing these layers to Teresa's sharing about prayer. And you rightly pointed out how Teresa does not so much teach how to pray, but speaks more in terms of what her experience has been. Can we build on that and ask to what extent persons, or is everyone who indeed is called to prayer, invited to share something of their experience in prayer? To what extent, at what point does one know that it becomes necessary to share their experience? Really, in light of how Christ tells his disciples, what you have received freely, give freely. And that would be our wrapping up question, if you could attend to that.
Well, I think that happens. It may not be something that one deliberately sets out to do or does in any official or formal way. But the effects of prayer always go out to others, always go out to the world. As the person prays, whoever prays, somehow they're a force for good in the world. Good is done. The person doesn't see it, isn't aware of it, but it is there. They know it and they believe it. So every person is praying, is doing good, is bringing about good in our world. If somebody is called to do something specific, God makes that known to the person. But it is not so much about doing something particular. It's about becoming the person one is meant to be. In a sense, we could say Teresa didn't write books or found monasteries. Those are incidental. What Teresa did is she became Teresa. She lived who Teresa is. She lived as fully, as completely as she could, the life that God created her to live. That's what's most important, not the book she wrote or the monastery she founded or the works that she did. They're just an expression of that. They're an expression of who she is, who she became. The person that prayer enabled her or facilitated her to become. The rest is just an expression of that. So what matters for any personal prayer is not what do you do, but rather what kind of a person are you? Who are you? That's what prayer will reveal. And the person who is living more true to who they're really meant to be, that person lives a life that is fruitful, that is life-giving for others, for the whole world.
Thank you. So in other words, I think it's the maxim from Saint Francis of Assisi who says, always preach the good news, and when it is necessary, use words. So let our lives speak for itself. Thank you, Father Matt. And this brings us to the close of this episode of our Living Prayer podcast. And thank you for joining in, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.